Good evening. Can you hear me? Excellent, excellent. My name is Steve McConnell, and I am one of the pastors here at Church of the Palms. And on behalf of the session and the staff and the foundation of Church of the Palms, it's my privilege to welcome you to our next installment of the Faith and Society Speaker Series. The mission of the series is to provide people in our community the opportunity to hear from a variety of leaders and faith perspectives about how Christians and the Christian church can address the issues of society, how to witness to the public square. We wish to be a model, where we can be a place in a community where we can agree to disagree, and are open to having our minds changed as a result of providing a safe place for people to challenge our presuppositions. We have welcomed folks from a wide spectrum of ideology: Michael Gerson, Brian McLaren, Greg Boyle, Jamar Tisby, Jen Hatmaker, Amy Jo Levine, Taylor Branch, Ross Douthit, Eddie Glad, Kristen Dumais, just to name a few. And we look forward to welcoming later this spring David French, columnist previously of the National Review and now the New York Times. Next fall, we will welcome Tracy Kidder and Jim O'Connell to talk about Mr. Kidder's recent book, Rough Sleepers, based on the work of Dr. O'Connell and his career in caring for the homeless of Boston. Each of the speakers we've had, no matter where they come from the spectrum of ideology, prompts emails to my inbox asking if such a speaker represents the views or opinions of Church of the Palms. And the answer, very briefly, is no. So maybe for some of you, I've spared you an email. What Church of the Palms, though, feels more and more called to do is, in the midst of an increasingly polarized society, pulled apart by social media, narrow cable news programs, and distrust and disrespect for people of other points of view, we feel called more and more to provide a community and a forum where, instead of talking, we listen, and we seek to learn from leaders in the Christian church about the faith we seek to understand and live. We believe that Christ is a multifaceted diamond, and the more facets we encounter in each other, the more brilliant the diamond becomes. And I believe this night will be of no exception when it comes to hearing perspectives that perhaps we need to hear, as well as we don't often hear, perhaps related to the various corners of society in which we find ourselves. A few little details about our place here. We have restrooms available. So women back there in the back corner of the narthex, and men in the back left-hand corner as you're heading back there. You received a little card for your enjoyment to see a few things. First of all, the speakers coming up in our speaker series, of which I had just spoken, as well as the events that are taking place right here in our community during our anti-racism 10 days, which has already begun. And we have, I've experienced one of these events a couple nights ago. And this event itself is one of those events in our anti-racism week. And we look forward to actually welcoming all those who are participating in that week and in the last day on March the 23rd, to wonder about what are the next steps in our effort toward anti-racism. We want to thank, and also on that card, at the bottom of it is an opportunity for you to give us your name and number or contact information so that we can make you aware, first of all, about all the upcoming series speakers, as well as to let us know, or to let you know how we are continuing to be involved in anti-racism efforts. The Suncoast Anti-Racism Coalition is born out of the Light of the World Church and Church of the Palms, and we are continuing to encourage people to participate in all sorts of anti-racism events. And so you'll, if you let us know your information, we'll be glad to get that information back to you. Tonight we are live streaming. Hello, live stream community. Good to see you all. But we will not be, per contract with Mr. Willis, we will not be making that video available after this event. So that will spare you another phone call to call us to say, where is it on your website? Well, we won't have it on our website. So listen carefully tonight to Jim's presentation. On to our wonderful speaker. Jim Wallis is a globally respected writer, teacher, preacher, and justice advocate who believes the gospel of Jesus must be transformed from its cultural and political captivities. He is a New York Times bestselling author, including books such as America's Original Sin, God's Politics, The Great Awakening, and one of my favorites, Christ in Crisis. And the good news is he's coming out with a brand new book. It is coming out in the beginning of April called The False White Gospel. And it is available on pre-order at Amazon. So you can go to Amazon and get yourself in line to receive a copy of it. It will be released, as I said, at the beginning of April. And I know that Jim will be talking about that a little bit tonight as well. So his podcast, The Soul of the Nation, features conversations with grassroots organizers and political leaders and discusses how to take action to promote racial and social justice, life and peace, and environmental stewardship. He served on Barack Obama's White House Advisory Council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships and has taught faith and public life courses at Harvard and Georgetown University. Coach Jim also served for 22 seasons as a Little League coach for his 2 baseball-playing sons. And he has been in Fort Myers this season, enjoying time with both of his sons, one of whom is still playing college baseball, and he's got the chance to watch him do a little spring training over this past week. So we're sorry to pull you away from that, for that fatherly joy. In 2021, after founding and leading Sojourners magazine and community for 50 years, and let's just give him a round of applause for just having done that. Reverend Wallis accepted an invitation from Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy to serve as the inaugural chair and founding director at the Center on Faith and Justice. Raised in a Midwestern evangelical family, he's a Detroit boy, as am I. As a teenager, Reverend Wallis questioned the racial segregation of his church and community, which led him to the black churches and neighborhoods of inner-city Detroit. He spent his student years involved in the civil rights and anti-war movements at Michigan State University, and thus the journey for him began. Well, Jim, we are glad that the journey has brought you here to Church of the Palms and to Sarasota, and we are delighted that you will be here to share with us your wisdom and your perspective from this great, great career of ministry. Would you please welcome Jim Wallis to our...
Let me say thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. Thanks for coming. Thanks for naming so many of my friends who have been here before. Eddie Glaude wrote the foreword to my new book, and he was here a month ago, right? So I want to just say thank you to start, to the session, to the Foundation for Church of the Palms, to Steve McConnell, to Sarah, Heather, Debbie, and Lanny, who served us dinner. Thanks to all of you. I'm not missing any games. We won today. I'll be there tomorrow. My son got 3 RBIs. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Okay. Public faith is what you like to talk about here. Prophetic faith. Telling the truth that God tells to us. This is about public faith, prophetic faith, right now, in 2024. Just a few months away from what I'm going to call biblically a kairos time. 2 kinds of time in the Bible: chronos, tick-tock, tick-tock. Kairos, when there are moments and times to change other kinds of time, change lots of things. We're in, I think, a kairos moment of conversation and choices and decisions. And, I've written lots of books, as the intro says, but this book, The False White Gospel, is, for me, the most timely, and for me at 75, probably the most important book I've ever written. It's for right now. And it's for facing a test of democracy, yes, that's true, but also a test of faith. The continuing of democracy, it hasn't been fulfilled yet. We've got a long way to go. It's not yet transformed as it should be. But if you lose it, you can't transform it. It's also a test of the integrity of our faith communities. And over dinner, we had this great conversation. And the third test is a new generation, like my two boys, and the young people I dedicate this book to. A new generation's watching us very carefully. And if faith communities come down in a way that doesn't seem to them to be speaking the truth of Jesus, but all kinds of other things, a lot of them are never going to come back to church. In my Georgetown class, I have all these, I smile, it's the best part of my week with those students teaching and mentoring. And I said over dinner, I'll just tell a little story that I told. Most of my students would be in the none of the above category. Their largest growing denomination in the country is the none of the above. I don't want to affiliate with religion. It's not a secular movement, as some people are afraid it is. Not anti-God, not anti-faith. Most believe in God or something bigger than themselves, but they just don't want to affiliate with what we in religion are saying or not saying, or doing or not doing. So I got to Georgetown, and one day I said, I just love the nuns. And a Catholic sister beamed and said, we love you too. And I do love those nuns. And I told the story when I was first going out years ago as a very young man to speak at conservative Christian colleges. There would always often be 2 rows of Catholic sisters in full garb in the first 2 rows in the auditorium of the chapel. And I said, sisters, what are you doing here? Well, we're local, Jim. I said, well, I figured that. But why here? Well, Jim, this is a very conservative place. I said, yeah, I know. That's kind of why I came. We think somebody should have your back. So I had nuns as bodyguards for years, which is the best people to have for bodyguards. But a whole lot of nuns are watching and paying attention to how faith will express itself in this critical moment. So Jesus has suffered identity theft in America, identity theft, with insurrectionists shouting his name as they violently took over the U.S. Capitol and shouted his name when they had taken over. Jesus flags, along with lots of other flags. How do we, every renewal movement in the history of the church, every revival, every new order, every effort to bring us back has always tried to bring us back to Jesus. Every one of them. So in this, what I've just written, the subtitle is Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding democracy. Eddie Glaude, who was just here, wrote the foreword, and his language of refounding democracy, beginning again, I like that. But there have been lots of good books on Christian nationalism. And I quote most of those scholars in the book and lay it out at the beginning. But this book is not mostly about Christian nationalism. It's about how to go forward, how to find the way forward. And it takes 6 iconic biblical texts. And I try and reframe and refresh those, not just for Christians, but for people who will listen to the words and wisdom of Jesus. And I try to apply them to where we are now. So, familiar text for many of us, but to reread, restudy, and all the commentators and studying and praying over them all again is what this book is all about. But let's do the whole white Christian nationalism thing. I'll just say briefly, the name spells the problem. White. Our lives have been changed by the most inclusive, radically welcoming vision in the history of the world. White? Christian. Yes, but it doesn't mean service or sacrifice or love. It means control, dominance. It's not new. It's the old, if you have studied this history, dominionist theology. We should have dominion as Christians. Really? And then nationalist. Nationalist. The Great Commission, as I recall, I'm pretty old, but I wasn't there at the time. As I recall it, Jesus says, go into all the world, to all the nations, make disciples of every nation, teaching them whatever I have instructed you to do. Nationalist? So this is distorted religion. It's bad religion. Now, I've got a lot of friends on the left who would say the answer to bad religion is no religion. I don't agree. The answer to bad religion is better faith, true faith. And that's what I try to wrestle with tonight. So let's talk about that for a while, and I want to make sure there's time for you all to talk to me and raise some quick questions that this pastor knows what's in your head and your heart, so we're going to have a conversation. And by the way, if you want to put this on your website, which I didn't sign a contract. I don't sign contracts, so I don't care about contracts. You can use this for whatever you want.
We recorded you just now saying that.
That's fine. Fine with me. So whatever you want to do is fine. Because I want to, the Publishers Weekly, they do early reviews of books. And of this one, they just said, this is an ardent manifesto. I thought, boy, that's right. And it promises to be a conversation starter, it said. And I hope so. And pray so. So let's put the conversation out. I wrote the book because American democracy is under more dire threat than any time in my life, but really likely since the Civil War. The bad theology of Christian nationalism, what I call the false white gospel, is playing a central role in undermining democratic values and trying literally to prevent our country from becoming a truly multiracial democracy. Let me say it again. Trying to, in particular, prevent us from becoming a truly multiracial democracy. The strategy of those on the other side can be summed up in a sentence. They want to prevent our changing demography from changing our democracy. Think about that. They want to prevent our changing demography, which they can't finally stop, but to prevent that from changing our democracy. And so that's what we're faced with. What does our faith say about that is the issue. Why Christian nationalism is idolatrous. It is the false worship of a nation. That's what it is. All my friends in the body of Christ around the world, the body of Christ around the world is the most diverse human community on the planet today, but not here. It's an idolatry. I think it's also a heresy, a big word, heresy. Heresy means things that separate Christians from Christ, take us away. How to bring us back is the question. So, the best way to confront this false white gospel is returning to the teaching of Jesus. So, let me just share just a few. Genesis 1:26. First book, first chapter, first book in the Bible. 1:26. Now imagine yourself, I always love the first line here. I'm surrounded, as we all are, by political noise all the time. In fact, part of my job is to listen to the noise and try to interpret it. Okay? Political noise all the time. And all of a sudden, in the noise, I read, then God said, be quiet. Let us create humankind, which means all of us, in our own image and after our own likeness. All our earthly talk about human rights and voting rights is from that bedrock, that foundation from the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. Are we all made in the image of God, particularly those who are different than us? Do you believe it or not? So any effort to suppress a vote or restrict a vote or keep a vote from counting based on the color of skin or any other reason is literally an assault on Imago Dei, an attack on Imago Dei, the image of God. I'm in a big coalition of leaders from 10 key states, including yours, to try and protect votes where they're really under threat. And my job in every call to all these new people is to, Jim, do the moral thing. And so I do the text. This is the text. I said, we are the Imago Dei movement. That's who we are. What does it mean to be the Imago Dei movement when people are threatening and making it harder to vote? What does that mean? So that's text. It starts out pretty clearly. And then in Luke, there's this Good Samaritan parable. You ever heard about the Good Samaritan parable? Yeah. So this lawyer in the story asks Jesus a question. Who is my neighbor? Now, the truth is, I can tell it was a Washington lawyer. I know that tone of voice. It wasn't, who is my neighbor? It's exactly who is my neighbor here. How can I get out from the obligation here? So Jesus, as his example of the neighbor, picks a Samaritan. Now remember, Judeans, who he was speaking to, didn't think there were any good Samaritans. They were a hated, half-breed kind of race. They were dangerous. They came in caravans with drugs and cartels and, oh no, that's somebody else, right? All the things we hear about all the other people who we should be afraid of, we're talked about with the Samaritans, false worshipers. Don't go near them. They'll get you into trouble. They were the other. So Jesus picks one who is the other, and he helps somebody. All the scholars say it was a Jewish man, beaten side of the road. He helps somebody who's other than him. This isn't a story about, you should just volunteer more often in your spare time. This says the title of this chapter is, Your Neighbor Probably Doesn't Live in Your Neighborhood. Think about that. And the Samaritan time risk. I've lived on some Jericho roads, and it's a risk because what just happened to somebody might happen to you if you try and stop to help. And two religious leaders passed by. They were too busy going to, a vestry meeting or something. Whatever reason, they didn't stop, but he did. Time, energy, bound of his wounds, took him and paid for his needs. Take care of him. And he says to the lawyer, who do you think was the neighbor here? Oh, yeah, that guy, yeah. The Good Samaritan parable could help lead us to a beloved community for church folks and a multiracial democracy. The Good Samaritan could help us here. So I try to do this all the way through these texts. What could help us here? Jesus casting the Samaritan as the good neighbor was very subversive. John Meacham, the great historian, is very worried about democracy, like I am, and he says, we've got to stop treating neighbors as enemies. But Jesus tells us to do what with our enemies? Oh my goodness. Even love our enemies. So making neighbors into the other, the feared one, the hated one, the enemy to us. The Good Samaritan goes right after that. Says, no, Jesus saying, here's how you do it. So, then there's this text in Matthew 25, 31 to 46. Now, this was my conversion text. I was in the student movements back in those days. I had been kicked out of my little church in Detroit over the issue of race as a teenager, so I was now secular, totally secular, in those movements. It's reading Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, and Karl Marx. We were all reading that. But after we shut down my Michigan State University, they won the day, by the way. When they had me back for a commencement, I said, thank you for having me back, because the last time I was here, we helped shut it down. But thanks for being forgiving. So, but I was there, and we had shut down the university. And so I wasn't satisfied with what I was reading in those radical writings. It didn't go deep enough for me. I wasn't getting what I needed. I decided that I wanted to be an activist, to change things, but that wasn't an adequate foundation for me. Wasn't strong enough. So I went, while I was secular, I left the church. Somehow I could never get shed of Jesus, somehow. So I went back and began reading these gospel texts. I read the Sermon on the Mount, and I had never heard a sermon on the Sermon on the Mount in my church. They thought it was for another dispensation after we all got to heaven. So what good will it do us there? But then I got to this text in Matthew 25. I call it the "it was me" text. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was a stranger. I was sick. I was in prison. I was that mother in Flint, Michigan, who couldn't get clean water without asbestos, it does brain damage to her kids. While the suburban white women in the suburbs were doing fine. I was that mom. I was that mom who's working 3 jobs but still needs food stamps. And they're going to get cut. When you ignore impoverished families, you ignore me. I was that when they separated those kids from their parents, migrant kids and parents, and put them in separate cages, we were caging Jesus. That was him. Or when, instead of educating and supporting and serving young black men, we arrest and kill them, we're arresting and killing Jesus. That's what the text means. And I had never read anything that radical in my life. So I signed up. Now, those economics of Jesus turn our politics upside down. Just upside down. So we actually take that text to Capitol Hill. In Congress, I've even used it in the White House. This is the text. It's meant to turn us around. It keeps converting me again, day after day. It helps to keep our priorities straight. It lets us say on Capitol Hill, a budget is a moral document. All budgets, family, church, institution, school, Congress, budget says who's important and who's not. What's important and what's not. And even on Capitol Hill, that phrase was coined by the faith community. But even on Capitol Hill, there are members now who say, well, we got to think of this, a budget's a moral document. That's the way we're supposed to live, and it's hard. One of my students said yesterday, it's sticky. I said, yeah, let's talk about that after our break, and we did for an hour. The most marginalized are the most beloved of God. The Catholics say preferential option for the poor. That's what the text says. It was Jesus' last talk before going to Jerusalem to be crucified and resurrected. And Jesus is not known to be very judgmental, as many Christians are thought to be. But he's pretty judgmental in this text. It's pretty tough. Pretty tough. And so the sheep and the goats, the two peoples, they all thought they were his disciples. They all thought they were following the rules and following him. Lord, when did we see you hungry and thirsty and naked and stranger and sick and in prison? We didn't know it was you. Well, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. Had we known that, we would have at least formed a church social action committee or something. Now, as you've done to the least of these, the most marginal, you've done to me. And when you go to Capitol Hill or to your city council or a governor's office or something, all the biblical prophets say that rulers and princes and kings are judged not by their gross national product or their military might or their culture being the envy of the world. They're judged by how the most marginal are doing. How are the poor and marginalized faring? How are they doing in your society? That's the test. So being in Washington, D.C., around that all the time, you can see that's why it's a test. It's a test. So I'm trying to take these texts, and I want to look at them again. Because a lot of folks, I think, are stuck, are oblivious. They don't know what's going on. We live in worlds that are just different worlds of information. People don't even hear the same things or know the same things. And when I was a kid, it's like Walter Cronkite after dinner. 30 minutes, that's all. That's the way it is, said Walter, most trusted man in America. Now it's websites, and pastors tell me, I got my folks for 2 hours a week if I'm lucky. But some of these news shows have them 24/7, or websites. I can't compete. So how do pastors compete? Now I'm going to get to some questions here, but let me say one more thing briefly, then we can do questions and then have some conversation. Maybe the thing that I'm most worried about is the text when Jesus says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." He doesn't say, know the truth and lie less often. The opposite of truth is captivity. Captivity. Truth and freedom are indivisible. And a whole lot of people in this country are captive. They're stuck. They don't know what's going on. Now, let me say the book is full of this, and I'll just say it, and I often say it again and again. America's original sin, taking the land and the lives and committing near genocide against one people, and then kidnapping a whole other people to do the work, was with us from the beginning. And so America's original sin is a sin. And the racism that gets catalyzed and focused and algorithms are hitting at people, all of that, racism is literally antichrist. And we have to say that. I'm glad you're doing a whole series here in this town, because what's at stake here is our faith, not just our politics. Don't go right, don't go left, go deeper, I always say. Go deeper. Deeper for us means the teaching of Jesus. What does it mean to try and know the truth and tell the truth in order to set our people free? Some of them good people, but they're stuck and they're captive. How do we know the truth, find the truth, and tell the truth to set people free? Last thing I'll say is we're up against a lot of marketing of grievance. Good marketing of grievance. Racial grievance in particular. Good marketing going on. They know how to do it. But we're up against something deeper, and I'll just close this part of the talk with that. In this season, our better angels are up against our worst demons. Every nation has better angels and worse demons. And American demons, the American demons of race, run so deep in this country. And how do we go deeper than politics, as we're discussing over dinner, and talk about what are our better angels and what are our worst demons? And how do we speak the truth in order to set our people free? We need all of you, this church and all these churches here, to do that in these next months ahead. All of us are needed. No matter what our faith, or denomination, or no faith at all, we're all needed. And I want our better angels to win this battle. How about you?
Thank you, Jim. We'll move our podium here so everybody gets the chance to see. Really appreciate your words. Better for me to lose my phone anyway. So. Lots to talk about. Why is it so hard for Christians to talk about race?
It's not. It's hard for white Christians to talk about race. We're in a situation where, in the word white evangelical tradition I'm from, what is the defining word in that phrase? Not evangelical, but white. White Christian. What's the defining word? Not Christian, but white. How do we get the core word to change the other word? I found my spiritual home in the black churches when I got kicked out of my little home church. I remember we evangelicals, we have lots of conversions because we need them, I think. We just have a lot of conversions. My first one was they put all the unsaved kids in the front row. Fiery revival preacher came on a Sunday night, and he pointed his finger right at me. It felt like, he says, if Jesus come back tonight, your mommy and daddy be taken to heaven, you'd be left all by yourself. It got my attention. I mean, I was getting up in years. I was 6, and I would have had a 5-year-old sister to support, you know. So my mom told me that God loved me and wanted me to be, well, I said, that's better, I'll take that. But the real conversion was when I'm listening to my city as a teenager, reading the papers, hearing the news, talking to adults, and something really wrong seemed very big, and it was the issue of race, all around us, everywhere. And we were talking at dinner in Detroit. My dad gets back from the Pacific in World War II, and all the GIs like my dad got FHA loans for their first house and GI Bill for their education. When you get virtually free house and free education, you're middle class. Biggest affirmative action program in the history of the country. Made my family middle class. No black sailors on my dad's ship got that. No black GIs of any kind. Had they gotten that, I wouldn't have grown up in a white neighborhood, white church, and white school. It was a deliberate racializing of geography, and the churches have been affected by it. And so instead of being believers who are talking about their faith and their kids and their futures and their health and all the rest across racial boundaries, the way the churches were meant to be from the beginning, we're just all segregated. So I don't find it, when I went to black churches, they were talking about the same personal salvation, but also social justice. And they didn't have a hard time talking about racial truth. And I got to know their lives, and that changed my life. And I think this conversation is one that a new generation is having and ready to have. And I think I'll just throw out a term that'll get a lot of conversation out of this book. I think we need something new called, I'm calling it a remnant church. It's the last chapter of the book. I believe there's a minority of white Christians, still a minority, but a lot of younger generation white believers who want to stand alongside join black and brown church leaders and literally create a new American church. We need a new American church where we not only talk about race, but we find the gift that it means to be that kind of a community. One of the texts that I go into in depth in the book is Galatians 3:28. There's no longer, Jew or Gentile, no longer bond and free, no longer male and female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. We all know that text. I discovered it was a baptismal text in the early church, read at every baptism, part of the formula liturgy. They're saying, in effect, so this Jesus we follow has taught us that these great pillars of division and oppression, always race, class, gender, always there, all the time, that we're called to overcome those and transcend those. And we're not perfect, we don't get it all right, but that's our vocation. That's our calling, that's who we are. So if you don't want to be in that kind of a community, you better go somewhere else. What if American churches talk that way? And most of us wouldn't see Galatians, that text was taken, I discovered, out of all the white slaveholder Bibles. Cut it out. Dangerous text. So I want to just go back to the scriptures again, to Genesis 1:26, to Galatians 3:28, and say, do we believe this or not? No. My church, when growing up, was afraid to talk about race. And I went to the black churches, and I learned not just about race, but about faith.
You quoted an elder in your childhood church saying, Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's a political issue. Our faith is personal.
It's funny you bring that up because this elder took me aside. He knew I was going into the city. I was working I took jobs alongside young black men who I thought could make me understand why white Detroit was so different than black Detroit. And their life stories were changing mine. I was going to black churches, just showed up at black churches, who always took me in and answered my obvious questions. But he said one night, son, you got to understand Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's political. Our faith is personal. And sitting there with him that night, this thing that was ripping me up, turning me upside down, tearing me apart, if my faith had nothing to do with that, then I wanted nothing to do with that faith either. And that's when I quit it. Just walked away from it. I didn't have words to go along with that night, but I found them later when I came back to my faith. God is personal, but never private. Say it again. God is personal. If God wasn't personal, what's the point? God knows every one of us and everything about every one of us in this room and wants a relationship with us anyway. If God isn't personal, faith doesn't mean anything. But God, it's not private. It's personal but not private. And that's the great heresy of the American white churches. The privatizing of faith. And we need to privatize faith because we don't want to look at ourselves. And that's what has to change. And a new generation is going through that change. And if we don't, they're not going to hang out with us anymore.
Thank you. Amen. I think it was in God's Politics where you said, we believe that poverty, environment, war, truth-telling, human rights, and consistent ethic of human life are religious issues before they're political. And I tend to agree. I most certainly agree with you. And those seem to be issues that people in the church quickly think are political, and it's the politics of it that prevents us from actually trying to lean into what do we do about poverty, what do we do about environment, what do we do about war. How does the church get out of that cycle?
Well, if you were to tell this congregation about all those emails that you get, I know pastors like you get a whole lot of emails about you did politics on Sunday, you did politics. Now there's a whole movement afoot to do politics in churches. And Democrats are told in churches to leave because they're demons. And certain political issues are lifted up as the organizing points of everything. Very political. It's a selective politics. And what pastors like you and I and others in this room and lay people need to do is go deeper than politics. To talk about Galatians and racism and sexism and the marginalization of 30% of Americans, 30% of us live paycheck to paycheck. To say those are political issues is theologically wrong. Theologically wrong. We need a theology of democracy. And people want to reject what they call your politics when you're preaching about what racism means theologically. So I want to do theology here. I want to say, here's what Jesus says. Can we talk about what that means? We can have a debate. That's okay. In this book tour, I'm going to go to a number of the people who are, I think, politicizing the faith of churches. I'm going to say, let's have a debate. Anytime, any place. You pick the place. Let's have a debate. Well, Jesus said this. What did he mean? Jesus went out and said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things I tell you? Good question. We can't keep giving lip service to Christian faith if we're not going to look hard at what Jesus is saying. So I want to have a conversation over many months here. I've been having many years, and it won't be done when this election's over. But we're at a crisis moment here. And unless we can, the first part of that subtitle, unless we can reclaim Jesus, we're in trouble in the church and the country. So when people say that, we say, what do you mean is the politics? Let's have a talk about that. Here's the text I used. I thought of it this way. Do you see it a different way? But what we can't do is stop talking about politics, as they say, which means stop talking about the moral issues at stake in our national life. I say don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. But let's go deeper here. So this is a conversation pastors are going to have to really show a lot of courage to deal with. I remember I was at Candler Theological Seminary about a year ago, and I'd given a talk, and the next day they had a bunch of pastors, young pastors, from around the South in to unpack it all. And it was pretty clear on America's original sin, as I call it, and the black pastors in the room felt really emboldened to say what they were really feeling, which is hard for black pastors in lots of climates to do that. They were saying, please, pleading with these young white pastors to tell the truth about racism. And most of these white young pastors would have had Black Lives Matter signs on their front lawns. They agreed, but they got talking about the cost of doing that. The young female pastor said, I could lose my parsonage I need it to raise my kids. We'll lose our pensions. We'll lose our donors, lose our congregations. One guy said to me, my pastor tells me I need to be attentive to the politics of our donors when I preach. And they were saying, this could cost us. And then someone said, yeah, kind of like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I said, yeah, kind of like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. When Bonhoeffer was in this country before he went back to Germany, he was at Union Seminary, and he every Sunday went to Abyssinian Baptist Church, historic black church in Harlem. Probably the only white guy in the room most of the time. But black preaching, black music, black liturgy, black worship really shaped what he finally called the confessing church in Germany, which I'm calling a remnant church now here. And one of them said, but he lost. He got hung in the concentration camp by Hitler. I said, yes, he did. Does anybody here remember all the German Christians who ended up supporting Adolf Hitler? No. Bonhoeffer inspired the South African freedom movement in the South African church. And here we are today talking about him again. So I think this is, I say more about this, but this is a Bonhoeffer moment for me. It's that kind of moment. And so I think it's going to be talking about the things that people don't want to talk about that will lead us to our salvation, because it isn't just politics. And they'll say it is to keep us quiet. And we can't let that happen. But I know the emails.
I think maybe it was in, I can't remember which book it was that you wrote about, the word crisis in Chinese is a combination of the two symbols that represent danger and opportunity. So
Yeah.
in this moment, this Kairos moment, what's the danger and what's the opportunity?
That's a great question. Eddie Glaude, who you had just last month, I quote him in the book, is saying something like, this is a time when everything is collapsing, yet everything is possible at the same time. I love that, because everything could just be collapsing. But if we face this moment, there could be things possible that I've dreamed of my whole life that have never happened. So, in some way, if we can, we're facing this autocracy coming at us, a racialized autocracy, and underneath a theocracy that wants to support it. That's got to be defeated. I say often these days, every movement has to figure out who they can persuade and who they must defeat. Say it again. Who they can persuade and who they must defeat. I mean non-violently at a ballot box. But we can't, I wouldn't have written this book if I don't think there's persuadable people. There are. But I also think there are people who are distorting religion, distorting the gospel, who are denying Jesus and using his name, and are lying, deliberately, overtly lying. And those people in religion and politics, I think they have to be defeated. Not even one applause for that? So I want to persuade like crazy, but I also want to stand against the voter suppression. And we're sending these poll chaplains into these most perilous polling places in these critical states. And last time, there were armed white men standing there in black polling places with their guns. All these black voters are watching them as they're standing in line. And if some kind of just activist had confronted them, or some Democratic partisan, it would have been a blowout. They got surrounded by collars, clerical collars, and bishops' robes. So we think you're in the wrong place. Let us show you where the bathroom is. Or I get a call from our lead in Detroit. Oh, I gotta take this. We got a big truck, pulled up pickup truck out of Black Elementary School right outside polling place. Shotguns, flags. I gotta get over there. And they got there, and they surrounded the truck. Said, you know, you're probably in a wrong parking place. We're going to help you leave. And a number of we heard voters in poor and black precincts were afraid to go and vote because all the intimidation that was being threatened. But when they heard there were going to be clergy, and sometimes their clergy, in those polling places, they went for information, for authority, and we teach people conflict resolution, how to de-escalate conflicts. So we have to show up in meetings, and town meetings, and candidate forums, and board meetings, and polling places. Face United to Save Democracy is looking for people. You don't have to be a clergy to be a poll chaplain. Lay people are cool. We'll give you a badge. But we got to show up. We can't just sit back. We've got to show up and be present with our lives and our faith in what is a very deep crisis.
We both lived in Detroit in the 1960s.
Yeah.
That was just a microcosm of all of what was going on in the nation.
Yeah.
You know, the issues of race, the issues of the Vietnam War, and a multitude of others. How do you compare that time with this time? Because the world felt like it was falling apart for many in the 60s. And as you just said, things are falling apart now. How do you compare those two?
That's a great question. Back then, there was a war that was, again, based on lies. And we felt like it had to be talked about and opposed. And so mostly young people raised those questions, which led to the end of that war. We felt we had to talk about racism from the core. And that led to mentors of ours like Dr. King and others who just Dr. King didn't even have a majority of black pastors with him in those days. It was only a minority. And when he came out against the war in Vietnam at Riverside Church, even a lot of civil rights people were afraid he'd anger the president. And so he stood up. He talked about the triplets: racism, materialism, and militarism. That was a tough speech in New York. But that prophetic voice caused people to rise up, and so we were following all that. And then a whole lot of those leaders were killed. And the nation went back to the old political debates. Right now, I'll just say, I don't think we've had this threat of losing democracy in my lifetime, or even since the Civil War, like we have right now. I think that is a Kairos moment. And back then it was a fight within democracy, for democracy, winning and losing. And we won some and lost some, and things went on. But now I'm not sure we take this seriously enough of the threat that now exists and the values behind it. This isn't just a normal election, and McCain, Romney, and Obama. This is not what's going on anymore. So it's about marketing our worst demons. That's what's going on. And how do we stand up as people of faith, not being judgmental, but being humble, but being clear about what this means for us as people of faith. So that's, I think, that's my hope. That's my hope, that this, we can have a new conversation. We're going all over the country with this. It's just my 2 cents. There's lots of other things going on that I'm part of. But it's how to have a conversation that can help people see what we're facing and what we could become. What we could become if we can push back this immediate threat. That this is political. Let me just tell a quick story that's in the book. But from 1970, when Sojourners started, thanks for the applause for Sojourners, we started in 70, and from 70 to 80, the story was young evangelicals, I was one of the young evangelicals, are changing evangelicalism. No longer just private faith, but a public faith. No longer just salvation, but social justice. There are books written, stories. In 1980, however, was the beginning of the religious right. And what we see now is a culmination of all that. And America's original sin is coming, I think, to a crescendo. It's no longer steps forward and backward. It's coming to a crescendo where we're going to either move forward or be thrown backward, with mostly marginal people suffering the most if that happens. So to me, we're at this crescendo, crisis, opportunity moment. That's what crisis is, right? So I think this could be a calling of faith. And I said to those seminarians, yeah, if you talk the truth about race, some of you might lose your churches. Some might lose many of your members, but you know what? Others will join. Others will join, and new people will come, and a whole lot of young people will come. And so it's willing to take a risk. I talked to my dear friend, family member, who is a head of church planting for a major denomination last night. He said, it's always a battle between the stabilizers and the renovators, the catalysts. All those who want to stabilize things. Let's not go too far. Let's keep our donors. Let's make sure we're not losing too many numbers here. And the catalyzers who start new things. He said it's about risk-taking for faith. So I want to see us, all of us, become risk takers in the season for our faith, what we think our faith means. And I hope that risk taking with us brings out that in other people too. So long term, I'm hopeful that we have an immediate crisis.
You said hope means believing in spite of the evidence, then watching the evidence change.
Well, this new chair I have at Georgetown, they delightfully named it after my mentor, friend. I'm the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Chair of Faith and Justice at Georgetown. And I learned my theology of hope from Desmond Tutu in South Africa, who taught me the difference between optimism and hope. Optimism, he taught me, is a feeling or a mood or a personality type. My wife is a cup half full person. I'm probably a cup half empty person. He says, no, it's not a feeling or a mood. Hope is a decision you make because of this thing called faith. Whatever you call faith. And Hebrews says, faith is the substance, you know the verse, of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And that's where my paraphrase comes. Hope means believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change. So hope is not always feeling optimistic. I'll just confess, I'm not feeling optimistic every day these days. Things happen. What's happening in Gaza is just heartbreaking and could just twist our politics upside down. Desmond Tutu was not optimistic most days, as the bishop had to caring for the suffering of the South African people. But he believed, because of his faith, that hope would win at the end of the day. And we have to be humble enough to know that we're not in control. You know, I am not in control of politics. I am in control of my own choices and my own messaging, what I say and what I do. That I can decide. But I can't control all these things that I see spinning in every direction. So I'm not always optimistic, but hope. And that's our biggest contribution as people of faith to social movements, is hope. Because when people become skeptical and cynical and withdraw, the powers that be win. They want cynicism, and they want us to withdraw so they can be in charge. So cynicism works in their benefit, despair. And also, I'll just say, cynicism and despair can be a kind of privilege for affluent people, because we may end up okay, but a lot of other people won't. So we gotta fight the cynicism and say no to the despair and act as if we believe those texts are true. We act on it. And if we act, maybe others will see that and join us too.
Tell us about the status of the Reclaiming Jesus Declaration, that you gathered all those people at National City Christian Church in Luther Place. That's where I did my inner city ministry when I was young.
Right. Bishop Michael Curry, presiding bishop, Episcopal Church, he and I pulled that one together out of our friendship. It did have a real impact, but then these political forces came into being, and reclaiming faith is part of this book. You mentioned that was your favorite book. I was glad to hear that, because probably mine too. And now, going back to that at a crisis moment. So he was almost stepping up onto the platform to speak at the sermon at the royal wedding. You remember Bishop Curry spoke at the royal wedding? And I called him and said, how many people had signed that declaration? He said, really, that many? So there's a hunger, I think, in people for reclaiming Jesus. And so what I've written here is not just to say how wrong and bad the bad stuff is, but how we have to reclaim Jesus to go back to where we belong, to help bring the country back to where it belongs to.
Amen. Well, I think we've stopped at a good point, and thank you so much for your time here.
Can I tell you a quick Desmond Tutu story?
Sure.
Since I raised him. So the first time I went to South Africa during apartheid, was asked to come by churches there, and I couldn't because I was on all the security lists. So World Vision put me on a visiting pastors list that didn't get checked for security. So they snuck me in the country. And so I went to St. George's Cathedral to meet up with Desmond Tutu and the other leaders there. And it was surrounded by the police, military, armed weapons, just hundreds of police. They had shut down a political rally, and so he decided just to have church. And so I snuck through the military and the crowd, and I got in and sat with my friends. And there he is, Desmond Tutu, sitting at the pulpit, standing at the pulpit. all of a sudden the front doors of St. George's get broken into, and these South African security police, who are just thugs, line the walls of his cathedral. They've got notepads and tape recorders. They're saying, in effect, go ahead. You just came out of prison. You'll go ahead, be prophetic. We'll get it down, and you'll be put back. And I was sitting there. I'd never been to South Africa. I'd been there lots of times since, but that was the first time. And there he is surrounded by military and police. And they're saying, in effect, I thought, we own this country. We own this place. We own you. We own your God. And he stopped preaching and looked down as if in prayer. He looks a little bit like Yoda, you know, little guy, long flowing robes. And he was quiet for a long time. We didn't know what was going to happen. And he looks up and looks at them with that smile, that Desmond Tutu signature smile. He says, "So, you're powerful. You're powerful in deeds, but you're not gods. And I serve a God who will not be mocked." Then he began bouncing like a good black Baptist preacher. "So, since you have already lost, we invite you today to come and join the winning side." And the crowd erupted, and young people danced us out of that cathedral, and all the military didn't know what to do with dancing worshipers who weren't afraid. And then 10 years later, I'm back at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. Guess who's the master of ceremonies? Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And I went up and I said, "Bishop, do you remember that day in St. George's?" He smiled. I said, "Today they've all joined the winning side, because there wasn't one white South African that day who hadn't always been against apartheid." Okay? And I learned from him the trajectory of hope. For us, it's faith that prompts hope, that creates action, that makes change. And at the party, the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, 150,000 of us were there, tears running down our faces. It's great to be at the party, but where we're needed most is back at St. George's, when you can only see the party or the victory through the eyes of faith. So I learned how it's the hope, the faith, the hope, the action, change. That's our trajectory of hope. So we're facing a crisis more than any time in my life. But I really want to say to those on all sides, hey, come and join the winning side. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Reverend Wallis is available for you if you brought a book or you would just like to say hello to him. Feel free to come up here, and I have a few cards that announce a little bit about his upcoming book and how you can pre-order it, so see me for those, whatever are left. And once wonderful for you to be here. We're glad that you came, and we hope to see you again soon.